Okay, so we're going to start talking about IQ testing. And I think to start with, it makes sense to talk about what we really are testing, because as much as we've talked about our more modern ways of defining intelligence in these broader and more inclusive ways, the reality is that IQ testing still only tests those original academic based skills, and so verbal and logic math skills. And that by itself is problematic. But in addition, the other things that are problematic is that we have cultural bias in testing, which means that, so this goes back to the idea that we, certainly by adulthood, but even before then, are becoming experts in our culture, and that our intelligence reflects that. And IQ tests are very much steeped in our culture. So the idea is that every culture is raising its children to be successful in that culture. So remember that part of intelligence is succeeding in your environment. And so we're teaching children and we're learning things that make us successful in this particular environment. And the people who make the IQ tests are also steeped in that culture, in that environment. And so the questions on intelligence tests are not culture free. They're very culture sensitive. And so if you grew up and exist in the same culture as the test makers, then you're going to do better on those tests than somebody who did not grow up or exist in the same culture as the test makers. And there are lots of questions on these intelligence tests that are very, very uh, culture bound. And it's easiest to see that when you look at some slightly older, so like from the 1980s or 90s tests, and the things that we assumed people should know that maybe we don't assume anymore. One very common question on these tests, just the information part, just like things you know, is what one of the easiest questions was, what is the main theme of the book of Genesis? And for those of you that are Christian or have studied the Judeo-Christian Bible, then you may know that Genesis is the first book in the Old Testament, and that the theme of Genesis is the creation, right? It's Adam and Eve and the creation of the world. Um, but it doesn't make you less intelligent if you were raised in a different religion or in no religion at all. That doesn't make you less intelligent, but it would mean that you got that first easiest question in that section of the test wrong. And that, in fact, will influence your IQ score, even if it's not influencing your actual intelligence. And so, in that way, there's cultural bias, and that's important to know. But people also have different motivations about whether they're going to do well on tests, and people also have different experience and understanding of tests and how to do well on them. And people who are very motivated to do well and people who understand how to do well on tests are simply going to do better on intelligence tests, and that has nothing to do with intelligence. And so we need to think about the fact that to the question of what influences our intelligence, how do we wind up with the intellectual ability that we have, or intellectual abilities that we have? And we know that genes play a role. And this is often not popular with Americans to think about. We like to think that we, at any given moment in our lives, still have as much room as we want to change our intellectual ability. But in fact, that's not true. And genes play a significant role. We can look at adopted children and we can look at twins, and that data all shows us that people who are more biologically related are going to have more similar IQs. And so this graph shows you the similarity in test scores. So these are, if you remember correlation, these are correlation numbers, right? So a closer to 1 means a bigger relationship or a closer relationship, and closer to 0 means less of a relationship. Adopted children and their biological parents, so the parents who gave birth to them, have a correlation or an overlap of about 0.3, whereas adopted children and their adopted parents who are not related to them biologically have less than a 0.1 correlation with between their IQ scores. So that speaks to a strong biological influence. We see the same thing with identical versus fraternal twins. Remember, identical twins share 100% of their genes. Fraternal twins are only genetically siblings, not actually genetically twins in any way. And we see the same thing with identical and fraternal twins. We could also look here, right? So if you look at that, this is more of the same kind of data. So identical twins reared together and identical twins reared apart. You'll see that if they're reared apart, they're less similar than if they're reared together. They have almost a 0.9 correlation. It's almost a perfect similarity between identical twins who are raised together, and less so if they're not. So clearly, this means that there's some environmental influence, right? As it says here. So this is a nice chart to look at. And then fraternal twins have more similarity than siblings, even though they're not genetically more related. But they do, all twins, even fraternal twins, share more of their environment because they're growing up at the same time in the same house. So this is a nice chart to take a closer look at when you have time. So we know that IQ is influenced by genetics, but we also know that IQ is influenced by environment. We saw that in that last data. And this shows you SAT reading scores, verbal scores, and household income. Let me move my face over here, and household income. And what it clearly shows is that children who come from higher income households have higher SAT scores. And we can talk together in our live discussion about the possible reasons for that. But we can leave it here just saying that some of that is immediate in terms of tutoring access and things like that. And some of that is more long-term in terms of what those households are like and what things have gone on over the whole child's lifetime. It's really important to pay attention to the fact that when we talk about IQ and money, that it really is the absence of poverty that's important. More and more money may make a difference for SAT scores, but the difference between, you can even look at this chart, right? The difference between making $20,000 and $60,000 is a much bigger difference than making $60,000 and $100,000. And so it really is the presence of poverty as opposed to the presence of money that makes the difference. All right, and then we should talk some about racial and ethnic differences in IQ scores, and I can't emphasize enough, this is not a genetic difference. This is not a biological difference. That we don't see these differences in all countries, we see them in our country. And with everything we've talked about so far, it's important to look at why those group differences exist in terms of cultural bias in intelligence testing, in terms of socioeconomic differences between these groups, and that the reality is that European Americans are less likely to live in poverty than African American children are, and that influences IQ scores, and that the tests themselves are made by and given by mostly white people, and that is going to influence how somebody does on that test as well. That we do better on tests that are being administered by people who look more like us, and we do better on tests that were created by people who have more similar cultural experiences. So not genetic. Can't emphasize that enough. And here we're going to understand IQ scores. You guys have a homework that we'll talk about in the live discussion that really engages you in thinking about this, and I think that's actually going to be your best way of learning about bell curves. But what you see in front of you is a bell curve. It's called that because it looks like a bell. Some of you may recognize this from math classes. And the important thing to pay attention to in a bell curve is a couple of things. First, is this midpoint here, and that midpoint is the high point of the bell curve. And what we're doing here is we are graphing the number of people getting a specific score and then the score itself. So if we look at this score of 100 here in the middle, what we see is that more people have gotten that score than any other score along the bell curve. And so if more people have gotten that score, some of you may remember that that is the modal score from a math class, or the most frequent, most common score, and that that represents that peak, and that we automatically, when we're doing IQ testing, whatever that modal score is, whatever the peak of that curve is, we label that as an IQ of 100. And so when we're talking here about what sort of intelligence scores, that is not the raw score on the test. That's the number we're assigning to whatever that score is. And so that is, so it's the modal score, it's the peak of the curve, we call it 100, and the most important thing is that we call this average IQ. It's this whole range here where you see this 68% of people. 68% of people are always going to fall into the average range, regardless of what the raw score is. And so what bell curves give us is reliably being able to say what percentage of people scored at the same as you or less than you, and that tells us where you score in terms of percentile rank. And we can talk more about this in class, and so come to class on class 2 with that homework done, even if you're not confident about it, so we can talk and look at that together.